Hello, I'm Justin Ridge. I'm the research coordinator for the North Carolina Coastal Reserve and National Estuarine Research Reserve. And I'm going to be talking to you today about research that's being conducted on one of our sites. This work has been a collaboration between two big institutions. We've got Duke University Marine Robotics and Remote Sensing Lab, which I used to be a part of as a research scientist until I joined the reserve. And so that lab is run by David Johnston, and there were several colleagues in that lab that participated in this research. And then we have UNC Institute of Marine Sciences with Tony Rodriguez as a major collaborator. All right, so drones or unoccupied aircraft systems or uncrewed systems, there's a lot of ways that people are calling this tool. And this is what the research that we're going to talk about in this presentation today, that's really what we're focusing on is the use of drones in the coastal zone. And so I'm going to give a really brief primer on what data collection with the drone looks like and processing, and then dive into what our research involved. Other presentations might cover this, but I'm going to just briefly go over the data workflow for using drones to create mapping products. And this is particularly involving just the capturing of imagery and then using that uh, for your 2D and 3D products. And so when you capture imagery using drones, you're conducting surveys with these lines collecting overlapping imagery. And then you're taking that imagery and you're pushing it through some sort of software. That's the structure for motion software. And when it does, it processes these images. It goes through different phases where it orients the cameras from initial positioning, and then it starts collecting tie points, and those are unique pixel clusters that it can associate across images and use that to further refine where the images actually exist in space. Um, and then from that, it can triangulate actual XYZ locations of the points and create a full point cloud. And from that full point cloud and having all of the images or cameras oriented correctly in space, it can orthorectify all of those images as it stitches everything together to create an orthomosaic, as opposed to just like a photo mosaic. So everything is oriented. It's a top-down view within this orthomosaic. And then because it has the 3D point cloud, it can generate a digital elevation model from that as well. Here we have a fly-through where we're looking at, this is actually has a mesh overlaid of the point cloud here, but we're flying through it within the software here. We can see where the cameras were oriented up in above from where the drone was taken in space, and then we're looking down on the point cloud. You can see here we're in this embayed area where there's water, there's marsh, there's oyster reefs. You can see little blue and green arrows here that represent ground control points that we placed out. And those ground control points were used for us to further geo-rectify everything within absolute georeference. And so everything is tied into uh, a vertical datum here as well. All right, so now that you have the basics of what we do when we're generating these drone-derived products, 2D and 3D maps, um, I'm going to get into some of our initial work where we were examining how accurate these products were and comparing it to some ground-based methods uh, and just trying to gauge how well, um, what kind of air we can tie to these products. Just to orient us before we jump into this, I told you that all of this takes place within the North Carolina National Estuarine Research Reserve. And so what we're looking at here is we're looking at, this is Beaufort, part of the Cape Lookout region of North Carolina. And the reserve is, it's more than just this area, but this is a large portion of it. The Rachel Carson Reserve, it's one of our sites. And so all the work that I'm talking about today takes place along this sandy stretch of shoreline here that faces the Beaufort Inlet. We conducted this work using the SenseFly EB RTK drone. So this is a fixed wing aircraft. And so we were conducting gridded flights along that shoreline I pointed out in the last slide. And we conducted multiple flights for comparison and to just kind of see how the accuracy, what the consistency is there. All right, so here we're looking at the western end of that sandy shoreline I showed you. So this is the western end of Birchall. That's the island that we've been using for the surveys. And so this is the survey area where we're conducting our accuracy assessment, and you're seeing here the digital surface model and the orthomosaic that were generated from our processing. I'm showing here how we distributed across the survey area some of our ground control points. Those are the blue X's you see. And then vertical checkpoints, those are where we were out with a GPS unit, an RTK GPS unit, collecting points across the island there. And then the little red boxes represent areas where we had a terrestrial LiDAR unit that we were out collecting, surveying these scans for comparison with our digital elevation models generated from the drone. All right, so here we're looking at the distribution of the air or the differences from the vertical checkpoints we collected across the island with the digital elevation models that were generated from our different drone products. The flights, I told you that there were a couple flights, so we have 3 flights we're displaying here. Those are the RTK sorties. And the top panel is showing where we processed all of the imagery and created the products without using ground control points. And then the bottom panel is where we brought ground control points into the processing and allowed that to further georectify our whole products. And so when you look at this, what you're looking at are the concentric circles. So you'll see kind of like 3 circles within these little dots. And so those all correspond to different flights. And so you can see how the air, the difference where red is much more of a difference, green is much less of a difference, how that varies across our survey area. And in the top panel, you can see how kind of the central area of our survey was pretty good when we're not even using ground control, but you start to drift away from that as you move to the outskirts of the survey area. So there seemed like there was some sort of effect and we see this in sometimes where there might be doming impacts depending on what the environment is like. So there's a little bit of skewness at the edges of your product, but when you use the ground control points, it snaps everything back into place much better. And so you see that actually all of that those patterns of air disappear, and you kind of see this more uniform level of air with a lower vertical RMSE root mean square air across the flights. Here we're just showing the difference between 2 of the areas that we were surveying, those boxes with the terrestrial LiDAR, right? One was in this more vegetated dune environment, one was in a much sandier, less vegetated stretch of the island. And so that's the one on the right. And you can see here that in the vegetated areas, you have a lot more differences between the 2 different methods, the drone, the UAS, or the terrestrial LiDAR, the TLS, and just based on like how the vegetation dynamics play out with those 2 different products. Whereas in the flatter, less vegetated area, you see a lot more conformity between the two products. here we can see how the interpolation of those surfaces plays out between the two, and the top panel is the terrestrial laser scanner, the bottom panel is the drone, the UAS, and you can see that there's sort of costs associated with each of these when you look at these interpolation maps, because when you're in the vegetated environment, with the terrestrial laser scanner, based on its perspective, it gets these occlusion artifacts from the vegetation, and so you get some wonky interpolation in those shadows of the vegetation. Whereas with the drone, you actually have this issue sometimes where a stretch of area that has a uniform image texture. So thinking about that sand that has like no unique features in some of it, where it's just one color sand, it has trouble picking up tie points, and it creates this chunky interpolation there. One of Alex, our collaborator, described it as a dog food. And so that's where you kind of have to understand what's going on when these two methods are being used. Okay, now that we were more comfortable with how we would be able to use the products and understand the limitations, and we were ready to move into using this to actually assess change that was happening within the reserve here in this barrier island system. So just reorienting you back to, here's this area of the Rachel Carson Reserve, one of our sites for the North Carolina Reserve. And we're again looking at Bird Shoal here, and we're focusing on, while we're looking at the whole stretch of island, we're also you'll see it broken down into different sections, the Western Bird Shoal, Central, and Eastern Bird Shoal. And we have data sets that we've collected using the drone over the several years from 2016 through 2018. In 2016, we ended up being impacted by Hurricane Matthew, which was a very large hurricane that swept in through the Atlantic coast here. And what Hurricane Matthew did, while it didn't necessarily have a large storm surge and wind and wave impact because it passed through pretty quickly and went inland, what it did actually do was it dumped a ton of water onto the coastal plain and inland, and all of that made its way out, making very, very high water levels for an extended period of time. So again, for these, as I said before, we were using this fixed wing EB RTK aircraft to conduct these surveys all along the Bird Shoal area. So this is actually like a snapshot from the flight planning software we're using to collect these surveys. Here, while we did collect, we're going to look at kind of the whole stretch of Bird Shoal. I'm just focusing in on, we did a much more focused area look at this western end of Bird Shoal, looking at the same area we were doing our accuracy assessment in. So we've got this vegetated dune area and this kind of very low-lying, low dune, sparser dune field. And we've labeled these kind of into foreshore, washover terrace, and tidal flat areas that we're trying to track through time. Right. As I mentioned before, Hurricane Matthew, not a whole lot of wind, wave, storm surge action, but tons of water and lots of high water. And so what we're looking at here is actually, we were doing some recon over the island during some of the high water, and you could see here active water flow across the island, displacement of sand that was happening in this really high water following Matthew's exit from the area. And so we're not even in, this isn't like, a storm is not happening now, but this is just the high level water afterwards that's causing some of the change. And so you have this high level of water impacting that the low-lying dune area, as well as this vegetated dune escarpment. And this is kind of gives you a more three-dimensional look at like what that area looked like. So here we're looking at a couple different time steps here where we looked at what happened pre and post storm, and that's Matthew, then post storm 1 month and post storm a year. And so what we see in that time frame, with Matthew, we saw some loss of the dune escarpment as that was eroded by the high level of water, as well as the foreshore that was displaced from the foreshore into that washover terrace and into the tidal flat. And then not a whole lot changed. A little bit of the foreshore came back in that 1 month after the storm. And then within that following year, we see the redistribution of that sediment in the washover terrace as some of that's pushed back more so into the tidal flat. You see the island kind of getting pushed more back, but you also see the dunes starting to build up from that sediment. Another thing that we were able to do using our drone surveys across the bird shoal area was to tie the elevation and the contour information into a longer term data set, tying that into LiDAR that had been collected over the years and seeing how that all has played out over the last several decades. And so we had LiDAR back to 1997. And so we have a data set now with the drones all the way up into May 2018 that we were using to look at how the island had been changing. And we can see that the island has been moving back over that time frame. Uh, and not only that, a lot of the change has been happening down in the eastern part of Bird Shoal where the island has been extending. And so it's been building out. And actually, when you look at um, how that island has been building out, and you look at also how this inlet has been widening through time, we can see a connection there in terms of what's happening as that island really starts to build out in length. So the shoreline length, we can look at this figure, really starts taking off. Around the same time that this is happening, we also see the inlet really widening. And so there does seem to be some connection there with what's going on. And then finally, this is an ongoing research on what's happening with this island. Is it, how vulnerable is it? It's part of our understanding. Are we needing to intervene to, help stabilize this island, which is serving as protection to Beaufort and some of the surrounding area? And so Hurricane Florence um, came along shortly after we did that study previously, and completely, it was actually a storm where there was a lot more storm surge, wind, wave activity, and it just plowed right over those dunes and really eroded a lot of the shoreline and dumped, facilitate some of this island rollover there. And so right now we're in the stage of just monitoring what the recovery is looking like with that. And that's another thing the reserve is partnering with the Marine Robotics and Remote Sensing Lab to do. All right. Thank you.